Welcome to another deep dive. Have you ever learned a historical fact that felt, I don't know, so foundational, so etched in stone that you just never even thought to question it?
Oh, absolutely. You learn something in school, you see it referenced in books, and it just becomes part of your mental furniture.
Right, exactly. Well, prepare to have your historical foundations shaken just a little bit today. We are traveling back to the year 313 AD to look at a document you might actually remember from a history class, the Edict of Milan.
And it is arguably one of the most famous documents of the ancient world. It's often credited with changing the entire trajectory of Western civilization.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our source material today reveals a, well, a massive historical plot twist. The famous Edict of Milan wasn't actually an edict. It almost certainly wasn't written in Milan. And it definitely, absolutely did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, it is always fascinating when the popularly accepted version of history completely diverges from the actual historical record. We are essentially looking at an ancient public relations triumph here, one that successfully overwrote the truth for centuries.
It really is wild. So today, we're using a comprehensive historical overview as our source material to really get to the bottom of this. Our mission for this deep dive is to separate that ancient PR spin from the messy, fascinating reality of how Christianity actually gained legal status in the Roman Empire. We've got shifting alliances, we've got propaganda, and a surprisingly modern legal concept that emerged from all this chaos.
And we are not just going to look at what happened. We're going to explore exactly why it matters to you. Because this story is really about the collision of fundamentally different ancient worldviews. It's about a frantic political power struggle during a period of intense civil war. But perhaps most importantly, it explores the very early, surprisingly modern framework for universal religious freedom and state-funded property restitution.
Yeah, that restitution part blew my mind. But I was looking through the source material, and to understand why this document, whatever you want to call it, was such a big deal, the text really emphasizes setting the scene of the early Roman Empire. It kept mentioning this Latin concept called pietas. So how did that idea actually dictate the daily politics of the Roman state?
Right. So pietas, or collective piety, is the key to understanding the Roman mindset. We tend to view religion today as a deeply personal, private matter of individual faith.
Right, like what you do on your own time.
Exactly. But the Romans viewed religion as a contractual obligation tied directly to the survival of the state. They truly believed that their success as a global superpower depended entirely on maintaining a good reciprocal relationship with the gods.
So it's very transactional.
Highly transactional.
Yeah.
If you honor the gods make the crops grow, and they ensure your armies win.
And the sources also use the phrase mos maiorum, which translates to the way of the ancestors. It sounds like tradition was less of a suggestion and more of a strict legal framework for keeping that divine contract intact.
That is a great way to put it. The traditional religion was the absolute bedrock of Roman identity. The primary job of a Roman leader was to ensure the gods were happy through these ancient rituals. And as the Roman Empire constantly expanded, absorbing new cultures across the Mediterranean, they had to figure out what to do with all the new gods they encountered.
Right, because there's hundreds of them.
Thousands, really. But they were surprisingly adaptable, using concepts known as interpretatio Graeca and interpretatio Romana.
So how did that integration actually work in practice, on the ground?
Essentially, they looked for common ground to avoid offending any local deities. They would encounter a new deity in a conquered province and say, your god of the sea is just another manifestation of our god Neptune.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah, they smoothly integrated foreign gods right into their existing theological hierarchy. It was a big, inclusive, divine umbrella designed to keep all the cosmic powers on Rome's side.
So the Romans have this big, inclusive, divine umbrella, but that entire system just hits a brick wall the moment it encounters the Judeo-Christian worldview.
It does, because the Judeo-Christian insistence was on one god, and explicitly that all other gods were false. You cannot smoothly integrate a deity into a pantheon when the followers of that deity are actively proclaiming that the rest of your pantheon doesn't even exist.
Right. It's a total system failure for the Roman integration model. And reading through the source, I noticed specific behaviors that resulted from this belief that made the Romans incredibly nervous. For instance, Christians wouldn't swear loyalty oaths directed at the emperor's divinity. And then there was this recurring issue with a thing called the Jewish tax.
Ah, yes, the fiscus Judaicus, or Jewish tax. It was a punitive measure originally instituted by the Romans after the Jewish-Roman Wars in the 1st century. Practicing Jews were required to pay this tax to the Temple of Jupiter in Rome.
Which is essentially funding the pagan state religion.
Precisely. However, historians note that after the tax's modification in 96 AD, practicing Jews paid it, but Christians did not, as they increasingly differentiated themselves from Judaism. So you suddenly have a rapidly growing group of people refusing to pay the tax, refusing to sacrifice to the state gods, and refusing to participate in the traditional civic duties that the Romans believed kept the empire safe.
And the Romans didn't just view this as a quirky alternative lifestyle. They viewed it as a literal threat to the survival of the state. Because if you don't honor the gods
get angry and the empire falls.
Right, exactly. To the Roman mindset, this was an act of civic treason. And that perceived threat is what led to the various forms of brutal persecution. Emperors like Decius and Valerian issued edicts that imposed severe punishments. I read about Decius. Citizens were literally required to obtain a certificate, right?
Yes, called a libellus. It was basically a physical receipt proving they had sacrificed to the Roman gods. Refusing to do so could mean torture, confiscation of property, or death. And Valerian later specifically targeted Christian clergy and upper-class Christians, trying to essentially decapitate the movement's leadership.
It's just brutal, though the source notes it wasn't a constant, unbroken bloodbath. When Emperor Gallienus took power, the church actually enjoyed a nearly 40-year period with no official sanctions. The ancient historian Eusebius called it the little peace of the church.
But it was incredibly fragile.
Very fragile. And that fragility brings us to the year 311 AD and a pivotal figure named Galerius.
Right. By 311 AD, the empire is highly fractured. We were in the period of the Roman Tetrarchy, which was this precarious system where the empire was divided between 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors, and 2 junior Caesars.
And as you might imagine, 4 ambitious generals sharing one empire is just a recipe for endless civil war.
Absolutely. Rival claimants to the throne were essentially using Christians as political pawns, either favoring them or persecuting them to build localized support.
And Galerius had been one of the most enthusiastic persecutors. But in 311, he suddenly issues an Edict of Toleration from a city called Serdica, which gets posted in Nicomedia. I read the wording of this edict in our source, and it is the ultimate backhanded compliment.
It really is.
He writes that Christians had followed such a caprice and had fallen into such a folly that they would not obey the institutes of antiquity. He's essentially telling them they have completely lost their minds and abandoned tradition, yet he grants them an indulgence to just exist.
What's fascinating here is the underlying motive behind Galerius's sudden indulgence. He wasn't struck by a wave of altruism or religious enlightenment. The source quotes the end of his edict, and it reveals a profoundly pragmatic, almost desperate plea. He requests that because of this indulgence, Christians ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the Republic, and for their own.
He is hedging his bets. It sounds like a spiritual insurance policy.
That is exactly how the historical record frames it. Galerius was suffering from a gruesome terminal illness, the empire was completely unstable, and he suddenly decides that alienating the Christian God is simply bad policy.
So he wants their prayers, just in case.
Right, so that the Commonwealth may continue uninjured on every side. He is trying to cover all his spiritual bases to ensure the security of the state before he dies.
That context completely shifts how we view these declarations. It was about state security, not some moral awakening. So Galerius dies shortly after, and that power vacuum sets the stage for the big moment. We move to the year 313 AD. The Western Roman Emperor Constantine I and Emperor Licinius, who control the Balkans, meet in Mediolanum, which is modern-day Milan.
Yes, they meet to secure an alliance and discuss the interest and security of the state, very much in the same vein of pragmatism that motivated Galerius.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The agreement they come to is what history remembers as the Edict of Milan. But our source material explicitly states that modern scholars completely reject the story as it has come down in church history. There was no formal Edict of Milan at all.
Right. It is a classic case of historical mislabeling. The text we have isn't even in the form of an imperial edict.
It is actually a letter, and it wasn't written by Constantine in Milan. It was a letter written by Licinius, who, by the way, was a pagan, and it was issued later that same year from Nicomedia to the governors of the provinces in the Eastern Empire after he defeated a rival named Maximinus Daza.
To understand how this administrative letter from a pagan emperor became the legendary Edict of Milan, starring Constantine, we have to look at who actually preserved the text for us. The surviving sources come entirely from 2 ancient Christian historians, Lactantius, in his work on the deaths of the persecutors, and Eusebius of Caesarea in his History of the Church.
So when Eusebius sits down to write the history of this moment, how does his personal bias actually shape the narrative we end up getting?
Well, Eusebius was a major supporter and eventually a close advisor to Constantine. In his description of the events, particularly in his later work, The Life of Constantine, Eusebius blatantly eliminated the role of Licinius entirely.
Just wiped him from the record.
Pretty much. Following a later civil war where Constantine actually defeated and executed Licinius, Eusebius portrayed Licinius as this evil foil. He elevated his patron Constantine as the sole divine mastermind of this great piece, effectively erasing the pagan co-author from the story of Christian liberation.
The victors truly do write the history books, and Eusebius just edited the co-author right out of the narrative. But if we look at the actual text of the letter that has survived through these historical records, it reveals something even more surprising. It wasn't just about making Christianity legal.
No, the scope of the document is remarkable, and it often surprises people who assume it was a Christian-only decree. It instituted a blanket decree of religious liberty. The text explicitly grants to Christians and to everybody the free power to follow the religion of their choice.
Let me quote another part of it from the source because the phrasing is incredibly powerful. It says, "We have also conceded to other religions the right of open and free observance of their worship for the sake of the peace of our times, that each one may have the free opportunity to worship as he pleases. This regulation is made that we may not seem to detract from any dignity of any religion."
That specific phrasing, the right of open and free observance, is a concept that feels incredibly modern. It is a massive departure from the mandated state religion of the past. And it is vital to remember why Licinius was circulating this letter to the governors in the East in the first place. It was directed squarely at a rogue element in the empire who was actively ignoring this new philosophy.
And that brings us to the antagonist of this chapter, Maximinus Daza. He was the Caesar in the East, styling himself as Augustus. While Constantine and Licinius were moving toward tolerance in the West and the Balkans, Maximinus was running an entirely different playbook.
He had completely ignored Emperor Galerius's earlier 311 instruction to stop the persecutions. While the West was opening the prison doors and releasing Christians from the forced labor mines, Maximinus was actively keeping them there under virtual death sentences.
And once Galerius died, Maximinus just went into overdrive. He enthusiastically renewed the persecutions in the eastern territories. The source paints a vivid picture of this, mentioning he even encouraged local towns to submit petitions against Christians. There's a surviving stone inscription found at Aracanda in ancient Lycia that directly asks the emperors to put down the Christians, calling them disloyal and complaining that their absurd novelty was offending the traditional gods.
Exactly. So when Licinius defeated Maximinus in battle, this letter, what we call the Edict of Milan, was Licinius's legal mechanism for bringing the newly conquered eastern provinces in line with the policy of tolerance that had already been established in the West.
So we have a pagan, Licinius, and a Christian, Constantine, agreeing to the exact same sweeping policy. How do their individual motivations align on this?
They arrived at the exact same policy from two entirely distinct directions. For Licinius, the pagan, this was strictly about keeping the peace. He composed the edict to stabilize the volatile eastern provinces after a brutal military campaign. It provides a profound historical insight, really. Historically, sweeping religious tolerance is rarely born from a sudden moral awakening among leaders. It is usually a pragmatic tool used by exhausted politicians to stop a bleeding empire and ensure social order.
Whereas Constantine's policy went far beyond mere political stabilization. Constantine was already a Christian at this point.
Yeah.
He tolerated paganism and other religions, of course, as the document states, but he used this agreement as a stepping stone to actively promote Christianity.
Right, and there is an ongoing historical debate about the exact nature of Constantine's faith. Some cynical interpretations argue that his initial alliance with the Christian God was just another pragmatic political move, that he viewed the Christian God as the most powerful deity on the battlefield and wanted that power on his side to protect his reign from divine wrath.
Essentially treating the Christian God the way a traditional Roman would treat a powerful new Roman deity they needed to appease for military victory.
That is the argument. However, the source notes that the majority of historians today believe that Constantine's adoption of Christianity was entirely genuine. They view this agreement in 313 as his first official administrative act as a dedicated Christian, a view supported by the massive ongoing favors, funding, and legal protections he granted the religion for the rest of his long reign.
And those favors started immediately with the text of this very document. which brings us to a huge crucial difference between Galerius's reluctant 311 edict and the 313 Milan agreement. Galerius basically said, you can exist, but the 313 agreement dealt directly with property rights and restitution.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the socioeconomic impact of the agreement fundamentally changed the landscape of the Roman Empire. Galerius's edict did absolutely nothing to restore the generational wealth, the meeting houses, or the land that had been confiscated from Christians during the years of harsh persecution. The Milan Agreement tackled this massive logistical hurdle head-on.
The instructions in the letter were incredibly explicit. It demanded that Christian meeting places and other properties be returned immediately. And the language leaves zero room for legal loopholes. It states the property shall be restored to the Christians without payment or any claim of recompense and without any kind of fraud or deception.
It directed provincial magistrates to execute the order at once with all energy. The urgency was palpable. And again, tying back to the Roman mindset, this wasn't just about modern concepts of fairness. It was about public order and divine favor. The underlying belief was that righting these historic wrongs quickly would restore ultimate justice and ensure the continued prosperity of the state under the watchful eye of the divine.
But think about the logistical nightmare of this in the ancient world. Let's use a modern analogy. Imagine the government confiscated a bakery from your grandfather 40 years ago. Since then, it has been sold to 3 different people. The current owner is completely innocent of the original theft. They just bought a building. Constantine knew that forcing citizens to hand over their current property without compensation would cause a massive societal uproar.
It would be chaos.
Complete chaos. So to solve this, he ordered the state to compensate the current owners directly from the imperial treasury.
This state footing the bill for a massive empire-wide restitution program is an astonishing level of financial and administrative commitment. And for the Christians, these immunities, guarantees, and property returns changed their entire reality. For the first time in their history, they could publicly observe their liturgy in its fullness without fear of the state apparatus crashing through the doors.
They could actually start building churches out in the open rather than meeting in secret house churches.
Exactly. They could begin to seriously mold the life of the empire according to Christian ideals. The historian Eusebius captures the profound, almost disbelieving joy of this moment in his writings, expressing how ecstatic the Christians were at this complete and total reversal of their public and legal status.
This era became known as the Peace of the Church. Eusebius recorded that the agreement stated, "It has pleased us to remove all conditions whatsoever." The oppressive legal slate of the past centuries was wiped completely clean.
That phrase, peace of the church, has such a lasting legacy. It echoes entirely through modern history as a universal shorthand for the end of state-sponsored religious suppression. The source notes that the term has been applied to the ending of persecution following Catholic emancipation in Great Britain and Ireland between 1778 and 1926. It is also used in Germany to refer to the period after the Kulturkampf, which was a bitter 19th century political conflict between the secular German government and the Roman Catholic Church over the control of educational and ecclesiastical appointments.
So what does this all mean for us today, looking back at this document that wasn't an edict, wasn't from Milan, and didn't actually make Christianity the official religion? It means the messy reality is so much more compelling than the polished myth. It wasn't a magical overnight Christianization of Rome.
Right. The official establishment of Christianity as the sole religion of the empire wouldn't happen for another several decades, specifically with the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD.
The events of 313 were deeply political. It was a highly pragmatic letter born out of civil war, competing ambitions, and the need to stabilize a massive population. Yet, almost accidentally, it pioneered the concept of universal religious liberty. It established the idea that a state could tolerate multiple faiths without the state itself collapsing. And it implemented state-funded restitution for a marginalized group on a scale that is still staggering to think about.
It serves as a profound reminder to you, as you consume historical narratives, to consider how the facts we take for granted are so often shaped by the public relations campaigns of the victors. Eusebius erased Licinius from the narrative because it suited a cleaner, more heroic storyline for Constantine and the early church. But history is rarely a clean, straight timeline. It is a complex web of compromises, self-interest, shifting alliances, and evolving philosophies.
It certainly makes you wonder how many other historical turning points are actually just an administrative letter from a province, spun into a legend by a devoted biographer with a clear agenda.
Cultivating that healthy, critical eye is exactly why we explore these sources. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on where this story eventually leads. Our source material notes that while 313 merely granted universal tolerance by 380 AD, Nicene Christianity, which was the specific, formalized theology agreed upon at the Council of Nicaea, was declared the state's normative, exclusive religion.
So they went from a persecuted minority to the only legal religion in town.
A complete systemic flip. So consider the massive psychological and societal shift that requires. What happens to the soul, the identity, and the internal theology of a radical, historically persecuted underground movement when, in the span of a single human lifetime, it suddenly becomes the very imperial establishment that once tried to destroy it? How does a religion of the marginalized adapt to holding the absolute coercive power of the empire?
From hiding in the catacombs to ruling from the imperial palaces. That is quite the paradigm shift to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and keep questioning the history you think you know. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're unpacking a really comprehensive set of source materials. Specifically, we're looking at a detailed Wikipedia overview of demining.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating topic because it sits right at the intersection of military history, cutting-edge science, and just sheer human resilience.
Exactly. And to kick things off, I want you, the listener, to picture this terrifyingly simple economic asymmetry. Manufacturing a landmine costs, anywhere from $3 to maybe $75.
Right, which is just a trivial amount of money for what it actually is.
Exactly. It's a piece of plastic and high explosive designed to just sit silently in the dirt for decades. But removing that exact same device safely, that flips the economic scale completely.
It really does. I mean, you're looking at costs ranging from $300 to $1,000 per mine just to get it out of the ground.
Which is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And that financial disparity is, well, it forms the crux of this entire humanitarian nightmare.
It's what makes this an invisible 500-year problem. And the source material we're diving into today outlines not just the grim math of the crisis, but the absolute extremes of human ingenuity mobilized to solve it.
We're talking wild stuff here. Everything from repurposed space shuttle fuel to giant rats and genetically modified botany.
It's incredible, but I think, setting a calm analytical tone here is important because we really want to understand the mechanics of this threat first.
Yeah. Let's jump straight into the engineering evolution. Since you guys are probably well aware of the historical shifts from anti-tank to anti-personnel mines, we don't need to rehash the basics. But the traditional image of a heavy metallic disc that's largely outdated now.
Totally outdated. Modern clearance challenges are all about evasion. The materials have evolved specifically to evade detection.
Right, leading to what they call minimum metal mines.
Exactly. We are talking about polycarbonate, plastic, or wooden casings, and they contain as little as a single gram of metal.
Which might just be the firing pin, right?
Yeah, just the firing pin. And that shift away from ferrous materials, it creates an immense physics challenge for anyone trying to locate them.
Because conventional metal detectors rely on electromagnetic induction.
Right. And that requires a substantial metallic signature to disrupt the magnetic field. When you reduce that signature to 1 gram, the device becomes practically invisible.
Especially in highly mineralized soil.
Exactly. And this leads to the daunting global math presented in our sources. Current estimates suggest there are roughly 45 to 50 million landmines scattered across approximately 60 countries.
45 to 50 million. And the clearance rate is the part that truly stops you in your tracks. The global effort right now removes about 100,000 mines a year.
Yeah.
So doing the rudimentary math there, that reveals a 500-year timeline just to clear what is currently in the ground. And that's assuming no new conflicts arise.
But, and this is a crucial analytical point in the source text, there is a massive caveat to those terrifying figures.
The estimates are often way too high.
Right. Initial wartime estimates are notoriously inflated. In the chaos of active conflict, deployment records are either destroyed, falsified, or they're simply never kept.
Especially when they're just scattered indiscriminately from aircraft.
Precisely. Mozambique is a perfect case study for this discrepancy. Early operational estimates suggested several million mines were buried across the country.
Millions.
Millions. But after the vast majority of the clearance operations actually concluded, the real number recovered was around 140,000.
Which is still a tragedy, but statistically a massive difference.
A huge difference.
But the psychological terror remains exactly the same. I mean, a farmer doesn't care if there are 10 mines or 10,000 in their province.
Yeah.
A single suspected device in a field renders that entire tract of land agriculturally and economically dead.
Until it is definitively proven safe.
Right. And that brings up a fundamental distinction in the source material regarding methodology, the stark difference between military breaching and humanitarian demining.
They're entirely different operational paradigms. Military demining prioritizes momentum and survival above all else.
Because combat engineers, sappers, they're typically operating under active enemy fire.
Exactly. Their objective is to breach an obstacle to maintain maneuverability. The sources note they might have an operational window of merely 7 to 10 minutes to clear a path.
Wow. 7 to 10 minutes.
Yeah. So in that tactical environment, missing a few devices on the periphery, that's an accepted actuarial risk to prevent the entire column from being targeted by artillery.
Speed is survival, but humanitarian demining operates on the complete opposite end of the risk spectrum.
Right. The mission objective there is perfection.
100% clearance.
Dictated by the International Mine Action Standards, or IMS. The goal is complete clearance to a specified depth, guaranteeing that a child can play in that dirt or a farmer can drive a tractor over it without hesitation.
You cannot just clear a narrow path. You have to thoroughly sanitize the environment.
And achieving that mandated perfection relies on agonizingly primitive techniques.
This is the part that blew my mind. Despite all our 21st century tech, the conventional method heavily mirrors the Polish mine detector invented back in World War II.
It really hasn't changed much. Deminers are systematically sweeping an area, and upon receiving a signal, they resort to manual prodding.
They literally insert a rigid probe into the soil at a highly specific 30-degree angle.
Yes.
And the mechanics of that 30-degree angle are both fascinating and terrifying. The deminer is probing the lateral sides of an unknown object, feeling for the texture of a synthetic casing.
Because if they probe vertically,
Right, or at too steep an angle.
they risk applying that fatal downward pressure.
Which, for an anti-personnel mine, is just 2 to 11 kilograms of force.
Tragically, the weight of a small child.
Yeah. And they're doing this for hours on their hands and knees in sweltering heat.
And the physical danger is compounded by staggering operational inefficiency. Former combat zones are inherently littered with metallic debris.
Shrapnel, bullet casings.
Destroyed vehicles, unexploded ordnance. It creates an overwhelming signal-to-noise ratio. The data shows that for every single legitimate landmine discovered, deminers excavate between 100 and 1,000 false positives.
I want to pause on the economic devastation of that false positive rate. I was reading this section on the Cambodian Mine Action Center, and they tracked their operational efficiency over a 6-year period.
That data is a sobering metric for the entire industry.
The sheer volume of wasted human capital is hard to fathom. Over that 6-year span, their personnel spent 23 million hours performing manual excavations.
23 million hours.
And 99.6% of those 23 million hours were spent digging up harmless scrap metal.
You're looking at an entire generation of labor diverted into excavating junk just to find the fraction of a percent that could actually kill someone.
Hearing a statistic like that perfectly contextualizes the pivot toward brute force mechanical solutions. If manual clearance is that agonizingly slow, you scale up the machinery.
Exactly. You bring in the massive mechanical flails.
Heavily armored vehicles derived from Sherman tank chassis, right?
Yeah, equipped with rotating drums that violently thrash the earth with heavy chains to intentionally detonate devices.
And heavy machinery just mitigates the false positive issue entirely by ignoring the finesse of detection. It moves straight to kinetic destruction.
Organizations like the Halo Trust extensively utilize heavily modified agricultural tillers and excavators.
They up-armor them and use massive attachments to just churn the soil.
They crush the polycarbonate casings and trigger the explosive safely away from the operator. The operational data indicates these mechanical assets can clear and destroy mines roughly 7 times faster than a manual team.
7 times faster. But the most compelling examples of mechanical adaptation aren't even coming from well-funded international NGOs.
No, the source material highlights the sheer resourcefulness of Ukrainian farmers in 2022 and 2023.
Facing heavily mined agricultural land and the immediate pressure of planting seasons, they couldn't afford to wait for international clearance teams.
So they engineered their own remote-controlled clearance vehicles.
Stripping rugged armor and drive components from abandoned Russian military hardware and welding them onto standard commercial tractors.
Human resilience invariably accelerates engineering when livelihoods are directly threatened. But machinery has profound limitations.
Right, excavators and flails require relatively flat, accessible terrain.
They are completely useless on steep mountain slopes, in dense jungle undergrowth, or in waterlogged environments.
So when heavy engineering fails, the industry pivots toward biological detection systems.
Nature's bomb squad.
Exactly. We transition from diesel engines to the olfactory bulb. And the detection dog is the historical gold standard here.
Their olfactory sensitivity is staggering. They are capable of detecting explosive volatile compounds at concentrations up to 1,000,000 times lower than human capability.
1,000,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
They are smelling the microscopic chemical vapor leaking through the seals of a buried mine casing.
But canine units bring significant logistical friction. The unit economics are challenging. Training a single specialized mine detection dog costs approximately $10,000.
And beyond the capital investment, you're dealing with a biological asset that gets tired.
Suffers from fatigue, requires extensive quarantine protocols across international borders, and experiences degraded performance in extreme heat or heavy rain.
Not to mention the psychological toll. A dog navigating a dense minefield can easily become overwhelmed by the sheer volume of chemical signatures.
But the source material outlines a brilliant logistical workaround for this called the REST method, remote explosive scent tracing.
Instead of forcing a fatigued animal to navigate a sweltering, dangerous field, they bring the field to the dog.
Precisely. Field technicians utilize specialized vacuum equipment fitted with polymer filters to draw air samples from designated sectors of land.
Those filters trap the volatile explosive molecules.
And then the filters are transported back to a highly controlled, climate-regulated laboratory environment,
where the dogs can rapidly interrogate the samples without physical exhaustion or distractions.
It dramatically accelerates the initial surveying phase of large tracts of land.
But if the canine logistics seem complex, the deployment of giant pouched rats sounds entirely absurd until you look at the underlying biology.
Yes, APO, an NGO based in Belgium, trains these rats in Tanzania. They call them Hera rats.
And the economics immediately improve compared to dogs.
Significantly. The training pipeline for a giant pouched rat is roughly $6,000, presenting a great upfront cost reduction.
But their true operational advantage lies in their physical specifications, right?
Exactly. An anti-personnel mine typically requires a minimum of 2 to 11 kilograms of downward force to detonate. These rats are exceptionally light, hovering well below that trigger threshold.
So they can physically scurry across an active pressure plate without initiating the firing sequence.
And the psychological differences between the rats and the dogs solve a major deployment bottleneck. Dogs form intense emotional bonds with specific handlers.
If a handler gets sick or rotates out, the dog's operational effectiveness plummets.
But the giant pouched rats are highly food motivated and lack that deep emotional attachment. You can ship a trained rat across the globe, pair it with a new local technician, and it will immediately start working for a banana reward.
For banana, that's amazing. And returning to the Cambodian scrap metal problem, the rats offer a biological filter against false positives.
Because they have zero interest in ferrous metals.
They're strictly hunting the vapor signature of the explosive compound.
The operational metrics are remarkable. A rat can effectively clear an area in a single day that would occupy a manual technician with a metal detector for 2 entire weeks.
Harnessing mammalian biology makes intuitive sense, but the entomological applications take this to an entirely different level. The research surrounding honeybees is a masterclass in exploiting existing ecological mechanics.
It really is. Scientists realize you can condition a hive of honeybees to associate the chemical scent of TNT with a sugar syrup reward in the span of just 1 or 2 days.
1 or 2 days of training.
And the mechanical collection process the bees utilize is brilliant. Honeybees are covered in microscopic hairs that generate an electrostatic charge during flight.
This charge is evolutionarily designed to attract and trap pollen grains.
Right. But it inadvertently acts as a highly efficient environmental mop. As the bees forage across a suspected area, those charged hairs accumulate microscopic particulate matter.
Including the explosive chemical compounds leaking from subterranean casings.
They're detecting these compounds at concentrations of mere parts per trillion.
Parts per trillion. And researchers then have a few ways to read the data. They can analyze the chemical composition of the hive itself upon the bee's return, or they can use LiDAR or camera tracking to monitor the swarm in real time.
Because the bees have been conditioned to expect a food reward, they will literally hover and congregate directly over the buried mines.
Just waiting for the sugar that isn't there.
It demonstrates how rapidly biological systems can map an environment, and we see this naturally occurring without human intervention as well.
Like with the elephants in Angola.
Exactly. Following the conclusion of the Angolan Civil War, researchers observed returning elephant populations exhibiting highly anomalous migratory patterns. The herds were deliberately and precisely navigating around established minefields.
Biologists in South Africa subsequently put this to the test in a controlled study, verifying that the elephants weren't just remembering safe paths.
They were actively detecting the chemical signatures. The elephants successfully identified 96 out of 97 TNT samples.
They statistically outperformed the canine units in the trial. Now, obviously, nobody's proposing we leash elephants and walk them through active minefields.
No, definitely not.
But it underscores how rudimentary our synthetic sensors are compared to millions of years of evolutionary biology.
And that realization is precisely what is driving the current intersection of demining and biotechnology. If we cannot build a machine as sensitive as an elephant's olfactory system,
We must engineer the biology itself.
exactly. Botanical genetic modification represents a fascinating frontier here. Researchers have focused on Thailcrus, a model organism in plant biology, and fundamentally altered its genetic response to specific environmental stressors.
The mechanics of the genetic modification target the breakdown of the explosive compounds. When TNT degrades in the soil over years, it releases specific chemical byproducts, primarily nitrates and nitrites.
And the modified Thailcrus is engineered to absorb those specific compounds through its root system.
Once absorbed, it triggers a phenotypic change, causing the plant's natural green pigmentation to shift to a stark red or brown.
The strategic vision for this is immense. You could theoretically utilize agricultural aircraft to seed thousands of acres of suspected inaccessible terrain with these modified seeds.
After the maturation cycle, drone surveillance could map the topography, identifying isolated clusters of red vegetation that accurately map the subterranean explosive contamination.
Similar synthetic biology is being applied to bacteria, engineering strains that fluoresce or glow under ultraviolet light when exposed to TNT vapors.
But the primary hurdle with biological indicators is environmental noise.
Right. No traits occur naturally in agricultural soils, potentially triggering false phenotypic changes.
Furthermore, these biodetectors are highly specialized. A plant engineered for TNT will ignore a device packed with RDX or other modern plastic explosives.
That limitation forces the physics community to develop alternative, high-fidelity synthetic sensors.
Which brings us to acoustic and seismic detection.
Right, which addresses the limitations of both biology and electromagnetic induction. Rather than looking for metal or smelling chemicals, this technology looks for acoustic impedance.
Because a buried landmine is essentially a hollow polymer container housing a dense explosive block.
And this structure possesses a radically different acoustic impedance compared to a solid piece of granite or a tree root.
To find that hollow container, technicians use specialized transmitters like loudspeakers or mechanical shakers to ping the surface of the Earth with low-frequency sound waves.
The soil and the buried landmine act like two coupled springs vibrating in response.
By utilizing precision lasers to measure the microscopic surface vibrations of the dirt, they can map the distinct acoustic signature of the hollow casing beneath.
It virtually eliminates the false positive issue caused by scrap metal.
But the absolute pinnacle of this high-tech interrogation is nuclear quadrupole resonance, or NQR.
This technology is analogous to magnetic resonance imaging in the medical field, but it operates without the massive superconducting magnets.
NQR directs a highly specific radio frequency pulse into the ground.
A pulse precisely tuned to resonate with the nitrogen atoms inherent in the molecular structure of the explosive compound itself.
It isn't just looking for an anomaly. It is interrogating the actual atomic bonds.
When the radio frequency pulse shuts off, those energized nitrogen atoms relax back to their baseline state. As they relax, they emit their own incredibly faint radio signal.
The NQR receiver catches that echo, providing absolute confirmation of the chemical makeup below. But, and this is wild, there is a profoundly frustrating vulnerability built into the physics of this multi-million-dollar technology.
The interference problem. It highlights the fragility of operating highly sensitive laboratory equipment in the real world. Every chemical compound possesses a unique resonance frequency.
And by sheer coincidence of physics, the resonance frequency for the nitrogen bonds in TNT falls squarely within the standard AM radio broadcasting band.
You can deploy a state-of-the-art atomic sensor in the field, and the faint elemental echo of the explosive material gets entirely drowned out by a local radio tower broadcasting a morning talk show.
The engineers have to develop incredibly complex algorithms just to filter out the local pop music to hear the bomb.
It is a stark reminder of the chaotic environments these clearance teams operate within. Automating that physical clearance process is the next logical step to remove humans from that chaos entirely.
We've seen unmanned aerial vehicles used for photogrammetry and route planning,
Yeah.
but platforms like the Dutch Mein Kampf drone are pushing toward autonomous end-to-end clearance.
The architecture involves the drone autonomously generating a high-resolution 3D topographical map, utilizing a suspended sensor payload to pinpoint the anomaly.
And then deploying a specialized robotic manipulator arm. The robotic arm descends, places a small, shaped explosive charge directly above the identified threat, and the drone retreats to a safe altitude before initiating the detonation remotely.
Which forces us to look at the final critical phase of this entire operation: destruction. Locating the device is only half the battle.
Right. Neutralizing it without causing sympathetic detonations or leaving unexploded material behind requires significant chemical and thermal engineering.
High explosives like TNT are surprisingly stable compounds. They require a massive shockwave to initiate the explosive train. If you want to neutralize them without a kinetic blast, you have to attack them chemically or thermally.
On a chemical front, researchers utilize a compound called DICA. When DITA interacts directly with TNT, it initiates a rapid exothermic reaction.
The two chemicals essentially consume each other. A technician can place a vial of DITA above the mine, remotely puncture both the vial and the mine casing, and the resulting chemical reaction safely burns away the explosive filler in a matter of minutes.
But the thermal destruction methods detailed in the source material. This is where aerospace engineering intersects with demining.
Yes, a company originally responsible for manufacturing the solid rocket boosters for the NASA Space Shuttle program repurposed that exact propellant technology.
They engineered specialized thermal flares utilizing leftover aerospace propellant.
The physics of these thermal flares are staggering. They are positioned adjacent to the exposed mine casing and ignited remotely. The solid rocket propellant burns at temperatures exceeding 1,927 degrees Celsius.
Roughly 3,501 degrees Fahrenheit.
This is essentially a directed thermal lance. It instantaneously melts through the polycarbonate or metal casing and subjects the explosive filler to such extreme localized heat that the material deflagrates.
It aggressively burns away before the pressure can build to a full detonation.
The United States Navy has successfully deployed these aerospace flares in clearance operations from Kosovo to Jordan.
When you pull back and synthesize all of the disparate technologies we've explored today, the overarching narrative is a profound clash of human extremes.
It truly is. We are looking at humanity's darkest impulses. The mass industrial production of cheap, indiscriminate weapons designed to linger indefinitely.
Countered entirely by the absolute zenith of human intellect, mobilizing geneticists, aerospace engineers, and evolutionary biologists to undo the damage.
It's a phenomenal demonstration of applied science driven by a moral imperative. The objective isn't merely the technical neutralization of ordnance. The objective is the restoration of economic viability to fractured regions.
It's about returning agricultural yield to a community, enabling infrastructure development, and letting children walk to school without fear.
Establishing the baseline safety required for civil society to function. Understanding the mechanics of a Polish detector, the olfactory limits of a giant rat, or the atomic resonance of nitrogen, it gives you a window into the sheer persistence required to reclaim that land.
The scientific community is committed to a multi-generational cleanup effort. We broke the environment, and these complex, overlapping disciplines are determined to piece it back together.
Yet, as we project forward toward the eventual conclusion of this 500-year physical clearance effort, the source material forces us to consider the long-term ecological footprint.
We noted earlier that these casings leak.
Specifically, they leach a toxic byproduct known as 2-4-DNT into the surrounding soil matrix. It is highly soluble in water, allowing it to migrate far beyond the original deployment site.
persisting long enough to alter the biology of the flora and fauna around it. It is literally the mechanism that allows the bees and the genetically modified plants to detect the threat in the first place.
Exactly. Which leaves us with a highly complex environmental reality to consider. Long after the physical casings have been excavated, the thermal flares have burned out, and the minefields are officially declared clear.
How many decades or centuries will the invisible, toxic chemical ghost of these conflicts continue to silently migrate through the groundwater and ecosystems of the nations left behind?
A haunting question.
A heavy, deeply complex reality to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you next time. Okay, so I want to start this deep dive with a little experiment today.
Oh boy.
No, I know, it is a bit of a cliche, I admit that, but just humor me for a second.
All right, I'm ready.
I want you and everyone listening to close your eyes. Seriously. Well, I mean, wherever you are, unless you're driving, please do not close your eyes if you are behind the wheel. But otherwise, shut them tight.
I have a feeling I know exactly where you were going with this.
You probably do. So I want everyone to conjure up the image of Tarzan. Just let the very first thing that comes to your mind pop up on that mental movie screen.
Okay, yeah, I am doing it.
Now, I am willing to bet the farm, literally the entire farm, that 99% of the people listening, and probably you too, just pictured a very specific thing.
Right.
A guy in a loincloth, probably shirtless, extremely muscular.
Swinging on a vine, maybe?
Oh, definitely swinging on a vine. Maybe doing that, that famous yodel yell thing. And most importantly, if he speaks, what exactly does he say?
Me, Tarzan, you, Jane.
Exactly. The monosyllabic brute. The guy who points at himself and just kind of grunts. The noble savage who is pure of heart, sure, but let us be honest, he is kind of dim-witted.
Right, yeah.
He is basically a human gorilla.
It is the ultimate pop culture osmosis, really. It is the image that has been burned into our collective retina for over a century now. It is what we call the Weissmuller effect, which we will get to in a bit.
Well, here's the mission for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are going to take that image, that massive cultural monolith, and we are going to smash it into a million pieces.
We really are.
Because we have been going through the stack of source material for this one, the original 1912 novel by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the extensive Wikipedia character biographies, the academic critiques, and the reality, the real Tarzan.
He makes the movie version look like an absolute toddler.
It is startling. We were not talking about a grunt vine swinger here. We are talking about a British aristocrat,
Right.
A linguistic genius who speaks more languages than a UN translator. A guy who literally taught himself to read cracked the actual code of written language without ever hearing a single word of English spoken aloud.
It is actually a story about genius. It is about heritage. And to be totally fair to our sources, it is also about some incredibly complex, heavy, and sometimes really uncomfortable themes from the early 20th century that we are going to need to unpack today.
Yeah, we have got a massive amount of ground to cover. We're going to look at the origin story, the wild divergence of the movies, the race and gender politics in the text, and the fact that, and I still cannot quite believe this is in the actual canon, he might actually be immortal.
That is a legitimate, explicit plot point in the books, yes.
So let us dive right in. And we have to start at the beginning. Not the movie beginning, but the book beginning. Because the lineage here is not just some random baby lost in the jungle.
No, and the specific details of that lineage are actually the core engine that drives the whole philosophy of the book. In the popular imagination, Tarzan is just sort of, well, there. He is part of the landscape.
Right.
But in Burroughs' novel, Tarzan of the Apes, his identity is incredibly specific. He is John Clayton.
John Clayton? I mean, it sounds like an insurance adjuster.
It really does, doesn't it?
Okay.
But he is John Clayton, Viscount Greystoke. Now, in some of the later movies, like the 1984 film Greystoke, they bump him up to Earl, but in the original text, he is born a Viscount. He is the direct heir to a massive British estate.
So this is not a wild child story in the sense of someone born into poverty or obscurity. This is the 1% of the 1%.
Precisely. His parents are John and Alice Clayton. They are the absolute picture of Victorian nobility, and they are sent on a mission to West Africa. Now, usually people think of a plane crash or a shipwreck when they think of Tarzan.
That is what the Disney movie did, right? A burning ship.
Exactly. But in 1912, the plot device was a mutiny.
That feels so much more visceral to me. A mutiny.
It sets a completely different tone. They are not victims of blind nature. They are victims of bad men. The crew of the ship, which is called the Fuwalda, mutinies against the captain. But instead of just killing the Claytons outright, they maroon them on a totally remote coast of West Africa.
Wow.
Yeah, they leave them with their belongings, some tools, and various supplies.
And this is where the log cabin comes in, right?
Yeah.
Because I think people completely forget that Tarzan did not start out sleeping in trees.
Right. His father, John Clayton, builds a very sturdy log cabin. He is a capable guy. He is a British officer. And this cabin essentially becomes the Graceland of the Tarzan mythos. It is where Tarzan is born.
But then the tragedy hits. And it is pretty grim stuff.
It is basically a gothic horror story for the first few chapters. Tarzan is born. His mother, Alice, mentally breaks down entirely from the intense fear and isolation, and she dies of natural causes when Tarzan is just a baby.
That is awful.
It is. And his father, well, that is where the jungle finally comes in.
The father is killed by Kerchak.
Yes. Kerchak is the leader of the ape tribe. And this brings us to the very first major correction we need to make today for everyone listening. The apes themselves.
Okay, hit me. Because in my head, they are gorillas.
Yeah.
In the Disney movie, they are gorillas. In the old black and white movies, they are, well, guys in really bad gorilla suits.
Usually rug-like suits, yes. But in the book, they are emphatically not gorillas. Burroughs was very specific about this in his world building. He created an entirely fictional species called the Mangani.
The Mangani.
Yes. He describes them as great apes, but a species completely unknown to modern science. They are larger than chimps, they are smarter than gorillas, and they have a fully developed spoken language.
That is such a crucial distinction. Because if they were just standard gorillas, the idea of Tarzan having complex social interactions and literally talking to them would be pure fantasy magic.
Yeah.
But Burroughs builds a grounded world where these creatures have an actual culture.
Exactly. They have rituals, they have a strict hierarchy, they have a language, and that is exactly where the name comes from. Tarzan is not just a random cool-sounding noise. It is a specific word.
Let's break that down.
In the language of the Mangani, Tar means white, and Zan means skin.
White skin.
Literally, yes. He was named for his most obvious physical deformity relative to the rest of the ape tribe. He was the hairless, white-skinned freak of the family, basically.
That is so blunt, but it really positions him as the outsider from day one. He's not the king of the apes initially. He's the ugly duckling of the jungle.
He really is. And Burroughs actually struggled with the name during his drafting process. Looking at his original draft notes, he toyed with calling the character Xantar, or even Tublat Zan.
Xantar sounds like a bad magician you would hire for a kid's birthday party.
Or a B-movie sci-fi villain. I think we can all agree he stuck the landing when he finally settled on Tarzan. It has a great percussive quality to it.
So he is raised by Kala, the ape mother, after Kerchak kills his biological father. And this is where the story usually pivots to swinging on vines in the public imagination. But this is where the real story, the one that absolutely blows my mind, actually begins. We need to talk about his brain.
This is the ultimate Blinkist takeaway if you want the high-level summary of the original text. Tarzan is a genius.
A polymath.
A legitimate, world-class polymath, and it all starts back in that cabin.
Set the scene for us, because this is the part that I think is the most unbelievable, but also by far the most fascinating part of the original book.
So Tarzan is a young child. He is roaming the jungle. He discovers the cabin his father built. Now, the apes avoid it. They think it is haunted or dangerous. But Tarzan is curious. He figures out how to open the complicated latch on the door. He goes inside.
And what does he find in there?
He finds the skeletons of his parents.
Which is horrifying.
It is incredibly macabre. He does not know who they are, obviously. But he also finds his father's possessions, knives, tools, and crucially, a portable library of books.
Who brings a library to a marooning?
A Victorian aristocrat. He had brought books to read on the long sea voyage, and among them were children's primers, picture books. A is for Archer, B is for boy.
Okay, so walk us through the cognitive leap here. Because this is a boy who has never heard English, He does not know what a language is in the human sense. How does he go from looking at squiggles on a page to reading Shakespeare?
It is a profound testament to how Burroughs viewed the character's innate genetic superiority, which is a theme we will definitely dig into later. But practically speaking, it is pure pattern recognition. He sees a picture of a boy. He sees the little black bugs, as he calls the printed letters, underneath the picture. B-O-Y.
Little black bugs. I love that description so much.
He realizes that those specific bugs always appear in the exact same arrangement whenever that picture is shown. He deduces that the bugs represent the object.
He cracks the concept of symbolic representation.
Alone, in the dark, over the course of years, he eventually figures out the entire alphabet. He figures out grammar. He reads encyclopedias, history books, geography.
But here is the catch, and this is the part that makes the character so tragic and interesting to me. He does not know what any of it sounds like.
No, he has never heard a human voice in his entire life. So he can read you a passage from the Bible or a dense history of England, but if he tried to speak it aloud, it would just be silence or ape sounds. He assigns his own internal phonetic meanings to the letters.
So in his head, God means the creator concept, but he does not know the spoken word God.
Exactly. He is quite possibly the most literate mute in the history of fiction. And this directly leads to that incredible reveal when he meets the first civilized person, the Frenchman, Paul Darnot.
This is the scene that should be in every single movie adaptation, but never is.
It really is a shame. Darnot is exploring, he gets captured, and Tarzan rescues him. Darnot is looking at this wild man. He expects a savage, and Tarzan, instead of grunting, pulls out a pencil and paper, which he found in the cabin, and writes him a note.
A beautifully handwritten note.
The note reads, and I quote from the text, "I speak only the language of my tribe, the great apes who were Kerchaks, and a little of the languages of Tantor, the elephant, and Numa, the lion, and of the other folks of the jungle I understand many, but I do not speak your language."
I speak a little elephant. That is the ultimate flex.
It is grammatically perfect. It is highly articulate. It completely destabilizes Darnot. He is looking at a naked man holding a bloody hunting knife who writes like a university scholar.
And once that door to human language is opened, Tarzan just consumes knowledge, right?
He is a total sponge. Darnot eventually teaches him how to speak, how to map the spoken sounds to the written words he already knows so well. And here's a fun fact. Tarzan actually learns to speak French first.
Because Darnot is French.
Right. So for a while, Tarzan speaks Manganian French, then he learns English, and then the list just gets ridiculous.
Give us the list. What else does he learn?
By the later books, the canon states he is fully fluent in French, English, Finnish, Dutch, German, Swahili, and Arabic.
Finnish. Seriously.
Do not ask me how that came in handy, but yes. And then he learns the classical languages, ancient Greek and Latin, and then the various lost civilization languages, Mayan, and several fictional languages he encounters in the Hollow Earth or Hidden Valleys throughout the Pulp series.
It really changes the entire flavor of the character. He is not some nature boy stumbling confused through the city. He is usually the smartest guy in the room. He is basically James Bond in a loincloth.
That is actually a really great comparison. Cy Weintraub, a film producer in the late 50s, actually tried to pivot the Tarzan movies to that exact James Bond of the jungle vibe, but we will get to why that ultimately failed a bit later.
So we have this super genius aristocrat, and naturally a hero needs a partner. Enter Jane.
Jane Porter.
Now, in the movies, she is usually this very proper English lady. Oh, Tarzan, do be careful.
Yes, usually very British, very aristocratic herself. But in the original 1912 novel, Jane is American.
Wait, really? An American?
Born and bred. She's 18 years old. She is from Baltimore, Maryland.
A Maryland girl. I had no idea.
Her father, Professor Archimedes Q. Porter, is an eccentric scholar. They travel to Africa, and again, the pulp plot contrivances here are pretty thick, and they get marooned at the exact same spot where Tarzan's parents were left 20 years prior.
I mean, it is Pulp Fiction. You have to allow for some massive cosmic coincidence.
It is the absolute engine of the genre. So Tarzan sees her, and initially, he is basically a voyeur. He watches her from the trees. He is endlessly fascinated. He has never seen a white woman. He has never seen a human female at all.
And this kicks off the romance we all know. But what is interesting is that it is not just a story where they stay in the jungle and live happily ever after. The book goes to places I really did not expect.
No, Tarzan actually leaves the jungle. He puts on a tailored suit. He travels to civilization to find her. He literally goes to America.
Tarzan in America. It sounds like a comedy sequel.
He drives a car. He visits Wisconsin. He visits Baltimore. It is a complete fish-out-of-water story, but he adapts almost instantly because, again, he is a genius-level intellect.
And they eventually get married.
They do. And they move to England. Tarzan formally claims his birthright. He becomes Lord Greystoke. He takes his ancestral seat in the House of Lords.
So he is sitting there debating tax policy and colonial administration.
Presumably. They have a whole life there. They have a son, Jack.
Now, hold on. I remember a kid named Boy from the old movies.
Boy is a total movie invention. The studios did not want a character that visibly aged, and they did not want Tarzan and Jane to have a child out of wedlock, which was complicated by movie censorship codes at the time. So they found an orphan in the jungle. But in the original books, they have a biological son, Jack Clayton. And Jack is a chip off the old block. He eventually runs away back to the jungle and becomes Korak.
Which translates to...
a killer.
What a lovely family tradition.
But, and this is a key philosophical point to Burroughs' worldview, Tarzan hates it. He absolutely hates England. He hates civilization.
Why? He is rich, he is powerful, he has his family.
He calls it the hypocrisy of civilization. He looks around at the social climbing, the constant lying, the endless greed, the way people treat each other in the modern cities, and he decides that the savage jungle is actually far more moral.
Wow.
Yeah, he reasons that in the jungle, a lion tries to kill you simply because it is hungry. There is no malice. But in London, a man tries to destroy you because of envy or greed or spite. He strongly prefers the lion.
That is a very deep philosophical stance. It is not just I like trees and swinging. It is a fundamental rejection of modernity.
It is. So they pack up and go back. But they do not go back to a treehouse. They establish a massive sprawling estate in British East Africa. It is a working plantation, essentially. They become wealthy, land-owning adventurers.
Okay, before we move on to how the movies completely ruined all this rich backstory, there is one fact in our research notes that I literally highlighted 3 times. The pills.
Yes. The Kavuru pills.
Please explain this to me, because suddenly we are shifting genres from jungle adventure to high fantasy.
Well, you have to remember, the Tarzan books ran for decades. Burroughs wrote over 20 of them, and as they went on, they got progressively weirder. In the 1930s, he wrote a book called Tarzan's Quest. In this book, Tarzan and Jane and their monkey companion and Kima encounter a secretive tribe called the Kavuru.
And the Kavuru have a secret.
They have developed a chemical, a specialized pill, that completely halts aging. It grants biological immortality.
And they take them.
They acquire a stash of them. Tarzan and Jane split the supply. They take the pills.
So according to the official written canon of Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan and Jane are immortal.
Yes. They permanently stop aging in their physical prime. Now, structurally, Burroughs likely did this so he could just keep writing pop stories indefinitely without having a 60-year-old Tarzan throwing out his back while swinging on vines. But within the actual universe of the story, it means Tarzan is effectively a demigod.
That is absolutely wild. It reframes everything about the character. He is not just a mortal man. He is an eternal guardian of Africa. So we have this incredible, multi-layered character. Multilingual, immortal, aristocratic, philosophical. How on earth did we get to the guy in the loincloth who can barely string 2 words together?
We call this the media distortion field, and it is a fascinating case study because it happened almost immediately upon adaptation.
It was not a slow drift over decades. It was a hard pivot.
Right. There were silent movies first. Elmo Lincoln played him in 1918, but the real cultural damage to the character's intellect was done in the 1930s by MGM and Johnny Weissmuller.
Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic swimmer.
An incredible athlete. He had the perfect physical physique, and that is primarily what the studio wanted. But the executives at MGM had a very, very low opinion of their audience's intelligence. They felt that a wild man who spoke Oxford English would be confusing, or even worse, unintentionally funny.
They thought it would look silly on screen.
They thought the general audience simply would not buy it, so they made a highly conscious decision to completely strip him of his intellect. They made him the classic noble savage. They literally invented the pidgin English for the films.
The whole me, Tarzan, you, Jane routine.
Which, ironically, is a misquote of the film. The actual scene is a bit more playful, with them pointing at each other and saying Tarzan and Jane. But the monosyllabic sentiment stuck in the public mind. Weissmuller played the role for 12 years. He completely defined the character for a massive generation of moviegoers.
And once that pop culture concrete sets in, it is nearly impossible to shake.
It is impossible. It became the default setting. Even when later producers tried to fix it, like Cy Weintraub in the late 50s, who finally made movies portraying a smart, educated Tarzan, audiences were just confused. They were sitting in theaters like, why is Tarzan talking so much? The dumbed-down version had completely superseded the real version in the public eye.
And then you have the other massive cultural artifacts that came from the movies. The yell.
The famous Tarzan yell.
I read in the notes here that Carol Burnett, the comedian, actually had a hand in keeping this alive.
It is a great example of cultural feedback loops. Carol Burnett used to do the yell on her variety show constantly. She said she learned it from watching the old movies as a kid. Her doing it on national television in prime time popularized it even more than the original movies did for a certain generation. It became a universal sonic trademark.
And the nickname, too. If you were a strong, athletic guy in the 50s or 60s, you were called a Tarzan.
Or a Tarzan was someone who was wild and unruly. There was a famous baseball player, Joe Wallace, who was nicknamed Tarzan simply because he was erratic and highly athletic. The name completely detached from the book series and became a generic noun.
So the character completely transcends the literature. He becomes a cultural archetype. But man, we have to pump the brakes here for a second.
Yes, we definitely do.
Because we cannot do a deep dive on a book written in 1912 by a white guy from Illinois about Africa without talking about the massive elephant in the room. Or rather, the intense racial and gender politics in the room.
It is totally unavoidable. And honestly, it is critical to understanding the text itself. You cannot separate Tarzan from the era of his creation. We have to look at the academic critiques provided in our sources.
Right. Edgar Rice Burroughs was from Oak Park, Illinois.
A town that, at the time of his writing, was a sundown town.
For our international listeners, or just anyone who does not know that term, can you explain the gravity of what a sundown town was?
A sundown town was a municipality in the U.S. that practiced a form of rigid, systemic segregation. It effectively banned non-white people from being within the town limits after sunset, often enforced by violence or intimidation. It implies a community deeply retrenched in exclusionary racial ideologies.
And Burroughs basically takes that specific worldview and transports it directly to his fictional Africa.
He does. There is a very seminal piece of academic work we reviewed by Gail Betterman called Manliness and Civilization. She breaks this down brilliantly. She analyzes how Tarzan was created as a specific fantasy of the ultimate male for 1912 white America.
And what defined the ultimate male back then, according to the sources?
It was a reaction to the perceived softening of modern civilization. The anxiety was that men were working in offices, getting soft, losing their primal edge. Tarzan was the fictional antidote. He was fiercely physical, violent, and utterly dominant. But, and this is the key to her analysis, he was white.
It is the whole blood will tell trope.
Exactly. Burroughs was heavily obsessed with heredity. The underlying idea in the books was this: Tarzan is noble not because of how he was raised, after all, he was raised by savage apes, but because his fundamental genetic code is aristocratic.
Right.
The thesis is that if you put a British lord in the harshest jungle, he will naturally rise to the absolute top of the food chain simply because his bloodline is superior.
That is basically eugenics.
The sources note it is certainly adjacent to eugenics, and the way the text treats the local Africans is really difficult to read from a modern perspective. We need to look at what the book actually depicts.
The notes mention the Kulonga incident specifically.
Yes. Kulonga is a local African warrior who kills Tarzan's ape mother, Kala. Now, revenge is a standard pulp plot point, but the way Tarzan exacts it is what critics point out. Betterman notes that the text utilizes explicit lynching imagery. Tarzan hangs him.
He hangs him from the trees.
Yes. And the text describes Tarzan's ongoing interactions with the local tribes as essentially a terror campaign. He views them as inherent enemies. Betterman argues that Tarzan proves his manhood by dominating absolutely everyone, both the animals and the black inhabitants of the jungle.
He even says here in the analysis that when he sees civilized Africans farming the land, his initial instinct is to kill them.
Yes. The critics note this reflects a very specific racial anxiety Burroughs held, the idea that the European male must always be the superior force. When Tarzan sees Africans behaving in a civilized, agricultural manner, it threatens his established hierarchy, so his instinct is aggressive.
That is incredibly dark. It really complicates the fun pulp adventure vibe that people associate with the character.
It does. Mariana Torgovnik, another scholar in our source material, wrote that Tarzan occupies a strange space where he is essentially a vessel for every fear and fantasy of the Edwardian white male. He is the ultimate conqueror who owes absolutely nothing to society but naturally rules everything he surveys.
So he is a deeply complicated, flawed figure. On one hand, he is this enduring symbol of freedom, of rejecting the rat race, of physical perfection. On the other hand, he is a walking billboard for colonial dominance and racial hierarchy.
That is the paradox of the source material, and I think, honestly, that is exactly why the movie studios dumbed him down so much.
Wait, really? How so?
Because the hyper-intelligent, eugenic Superman supremacist angle is actually quite frightening. A noble savage who is just a dim-witted friend to the jungle animals is much, much more palatable to a general audience than a genius Superman who dominates an entire continent through sheer force and intellect.
It is a fascinating take. The dumb version is actually the safe version?
In many ways, according to the cultural analysis, yes.
But despite all this heavy baggage, and it is undeniably heavy baggage, the character's cultural legacy is massive. And not just in fiction. He actually impacted real, tangible science.
This is one of my favorite connections in the deep dive. We have to talk about Jane Goodall.
The Jane Goodall.
Yeah.
The legendary primatologist who changed how we understand primates forever.
She has gone on record many times stating that the Tarzan books were a massive influence on her childhood. She absolutely loved them.
I read that she actually had a childhood crush on him.
She did. She famously said in interviews that she would have been a much better spouse for Tarzan than Jane Porter was. She felt the fictional Jane was far too prissy for the jungle.
She was like, move over. I actually understand the chimps. Let me handle this.
Exactly. And if you think about it, her incredible life's work, going to Gombe, living among the chimpanzees, being accepted by them, is basically the scientific realization of the Tarzan fantasy.
Yeah.
She took that fictional premise and made it real, but she did it with deep empathy and rigorous science instead of colonial dominance.
That is a really beautiful redemption of the original concept.
And the scientific community has nodded back to that pulp legacy. There is a species of chameleon discovered in Madagascar that is officially named Kaluma Tarzan.
That is so cool. But not everyone in the literary world loved him, obviously. Rudyard Kipling comes to mind.
Yes, the author of the Jungle Book.
The guy who basically invented the modern feral child genre with Mowgli, he was not impressed with Burroughs at all.
Not in the slightest.
What did he actually say?
He reportedly said that Burroughs wrote Tarzan just to see, quote, how bad a book he could write and get away with it.
Ouch, that is some serious Edwardian author-on-author shade right there.
He felt it was highly derivative. And to be fair, it was. Tarzan is basically an adult, sexualized, violent version of Mowgli, but Tarzan ended up becoming the archetype for something else entirely that Kipling never anticipated.
Superheroes.
Yes. Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman, explicitly cited Tarzan, along with another Burroughs character, John Carter, as a primary inspiration for the creation of the Man of Steel.
I never made that connection before reading the notes, but now that you say it, it is incredibly obvious.
Think about the core structure. A being of superior innate ability arrives in a new environment, whether that is the jungle or Kansas, is raised by locals who are fundamentally different from him, discovers he has powers or abilities far beyond everyone else, and operates with a dual identity. Clark Kent is essentially Lord Greystoke. Superman is Tarzan.
Tarzan is the missing link. He bridges the gap between the Victorian adventurer and the modern comic book superhero.
He is the definitive proto-superhero. He even has the secret lair in the jungle and the iconic costume, or lack thereof.
So we have covered a truly massive amount of ground in this deep dive. We have gone from the fictional Mangani linguistics to the British House of Lords, from immortality pills to sundown towns, and from Jane Goodall's primatology all the way to the origins of Superman.
It is an incredibly dense text when you really unpack it. It is not just a cheap pulp novel. It is a complex time capsule of 1912 ideologies.
And that actually brings me to the thought I want to leave everyone with today.
Okay, let us hear it.
If we take the book canon as absolute fact, if we accept that Tarzan and Jane took those Kavuru pills,
Which we must if we are strictly respecting the source text.
Tarzan is still out there somewhere. He lived through World War I. He lived through World War II. He saw the complete end of the British Empire, his own inherited empire. He saw the moon landing. He saw the rise of the internet.
It is a fascinating trajectory to imagine.
So here's the question for you to mull over. How would a Victorian-born, jungle-raised, hyper-intelligent, immortal ape man view our modern world today?
It is a really gripping question.
Would he be on Twitter? Or would he look at our smartphones, our endless social media, our disconnected urban lives, and see it as just the ultimate terrifying form of that hypocrisy of civilization he hated so much back in London?
I expect he would retreat even deeper into the jungle, honestly.
Yeah.
Or maybe he would be out there leading the most aggressive, uncompromising conservation movement the world has ever seen.
Fighting for the climate. I could definitely see that. Or maybe he is just hanging out somewhere hidden with a kavuru, shaking his head at all of us.
Just waiting for us to figure it all out.
It is definitely something to think about the next time you see a guy in a loincloth on TV. There is a whole lot more going on under the surface than just swinging on vines.
Indeed there is.
Well, thank you for diving deep with us today. This was a wild one.
My pleasure entirely.
Stay curious, everyone.